The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her civilian clothes one final time before stepping out of a rental car. At 38 years old, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that spoke of years of leadership and command, though nothing about her appearance today suggested her true rank or the weight of responsibility she bore. Dressed in simple khakis and a navy blazer, she looked more like a visiting consultant than one of the most decorated officers in the United States Army. The base buzzed with typical morning activity as soldiers went about their daily routines, their boots creating a rhythmic percussion against the asphalt. Sarah had specifically requested this unofficial visit, wanting to observe operations without the usual fanfare that accompanied high-ranking inspections. She believed that the true measure of a military unit could only be seen when they thought no one important was watching. As she approached the main administrative building, Sarah noticed a group of junior enlisted soldiers struggling with heavy equipment boxes near the loading dock. Their supervisor, a burly sergeant, barked orders while standing in the shade, making no effort to assist his struggling subordinates. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she continued walking, making mental notes about what she observed. Inside the building's lobby, the atmosphere was typical of any military installation, efficient, purposeful, but with an underlying tension that suggested not everything was running as smoothly as it should. The receptionist, a young corporal with tired eyes, barely looked up as Sarah approached the desk. "I'm here to see Colonel Bradley Walsh," Sarah said politely, presenting her civilian identification. "I believe he's expecting me." The corporal glanced at her ID with mild disinterest before picking up the phone. "Colonel Walsh, there's a lady here to see you. Sarah Martinez." "Yes, sir." He hung up and pointed down a hallway. "Third door on the left, ma'am." Sarah thanked him and made her way down the corridor, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished linoleum. The walls were lined with the usual military decorations, photos of past commanders, unit citations, and motivational posters that had seen better days. Everything looked regulation, but there was something sterile about it all, as if the human element had been systematically stripped away. Colonel Bradley Walsh's office door stood open, and Sarah could see him inside, speaking animatedly on the phone while gesturing with his free hand. He was a man in his mid-40s with graying temples and the kind of military bearing that demanded attention in any room. His uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and badge positioned with precision that bordered on obsession. Walsh noticed her standing in the doorway and held up one finger, indicating she should wait. Sarah remained patient, using the time to observe his office. It was larger than necessary, filled with awards, photographs of Walsh with various dignitaries, and an oversized American flag that dominated one wall. Everything seemed designed to impress rather than function. "Listen, General Morrison," Walsh was saying into the phone, his voice carrying the tone of someone who believed his words carried great weight. "I've been running this base for 3 years now, and I can assure you that we don't need some outside consultant coming in here telling us how to do our jobs. We're operating at peak efficiency." Sarah raised an eyebrow at this comment, but remained silent. Walsh continued his conversation, seemingly oblivious to her presence. "I don't care what kind of credentials this Martinez person supposedly has. I've looked into their background, and honestly, I'm not impressed. Probably some Pentagon desk jockey who's never seen real command. You know how these civilian contractors are, all theory and no practical experience." The irony was not lost on Sarah. She had indeed worked at the Pentagon, but her role there had been far from that of a desk jockey. As Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, she had overseen military operations across 3 continents and had been instrumental in developing new strategies that had saved countless lives and resources. Finally, Walsh ended his call and turned his attention to Sarah with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ms. Martinez, I presume? I'm Colonel Walsh, commanding officer of this installation." He didn't stand or offer his hand, instead gesturing casually to a chair across from his desk, as if she were a subordinate reporting for duty. "Colonel Walsh," Sarah replied evenly, taking the offered seat. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Well, when the Pentagon sends someone to evaluate our operational efficiency," Walsh said, making air quotes with obvious disdain, "I suppose I don't have much choice in the matter, do I?" He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Though, I have to say, I'm curious about what qualifications you think you have to assess military operations." Sarah remained composed, though she felt a familiar stirring of irritation at his dismissive tone. Throughout her career, she had encountered men like Walsh, officers who confused rank with competence and believed that military bearing alone was sufficient to command respect. "I have some experience in military operations," she said simply. Walsh laughed, a sound devoid of genuine mirth. "Some experience? Ms. Martinez, I've been in the Army for 22 years. I've commanded troops in 2 combat deployments, managed logistics operations across multiple theaters, and transformed this base from a barely functional outpost into one of the most efficient installations in the region. What exactly is your military background?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could reveal her true identity and rank, ending this charade immediately, or she could allow Walsh to continue digging his own professional grave. The original plan had been to maintain her cover for the duration of the inspection, gathering unfiltered observations about the base's operations. But Walsh's arrogance was making that increasingly difficult. "I prefer to let my observations speak for themselves," Sarah replied diplomatically. "Perhaps you could show me around the base? I'd like to see your operations firsthand." Walsh's expression shifted to one of barely concealed annoyance. "Look, Ms. Martinez, I don't know who you impressed at the Pentagon to get this assignment, but let me make something clear. This isn't some corporate office where you can walk around with a clipboard asking pointed questions. This is a military installation with serious responsibilities. We don't have time for amateur hour." Sarah felt her patience beginning to wear thin, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "I assure you, Colonel, that I take military operations very seriously." "Do you?" Walsh stood up abruptly and walked to his wall of awards and photographs. "You see these commendations? These represent years of dedicated service and proven leadership. I didn't get to where I am by sitting in conference rooms theorizing about military strategy. I earned my rank through blood, sweat, and sacrifice." He turned back to face her, his eyes cold and calculating. "I've dealt with your type before, civilian contractors who think a few months of briefings and some PowerPoint presentations make them experts on military affairs. You probably have some fancy MBA and think that business principles apply to combat operations." Sarah almost smiled at the irony. While she did indeed hold an MBA from Harvard Business School, she had earned it during a sabbatical from active duty, between her deployments to Afghanistan and her assignment to lead a special operations task force in Eastern Europe. Her academic credentials were the least impressive items on a resume that included Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, and commendations from heads of state. "I'm here to learn, Colonel," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "Perhaps you could help me understand how you've achieved such remarkable efficiency here." Walsh's chest puffed out slightly at what he perceived as acknowledgement of his accomplishments. "Well, it starts with proper leadership and discipline. Too many bases these days are going soft, worried more about political correctness than military readiness. Here, we do things the right way, the Army way." As if summoned by his words, there was a knock at the office door. A young lieutenant appeared, his uniform slightly disheveled and his expression anxious. "Sir," the lieutenant began hesitantly, "we have a situation with the morning PT formation. Sergeant Collins is asking for guidance on." "Interrupt," Walsh snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Can't you see I'm in an important meeting? Handle it yourself, Lieutenant. That's what junior officers are for." "But, sir," Sergeant Collins specifically said. "I don't care what Sergeant Collins said." Walsh's voice rose to a near shout. "If you can't handle a simple PT formation without running to me for guidance, then maybe you're not cut out for military leadership. Figure it out. I'll find someone who can." The lieutenant's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration, but he maintained his military bearing. "Yes, sir. I'll handle it." He turned to leave, then paused. "Sir, should I inform the men about the new physical training standards that came down from—" "Did I stutter, Lieutenant?" Walsh interrupted again. "I said handle it. That means handle it quietly and efficiently without bothering me with every minor detail. Now get out of my office before I start questioning your fitness for your current position." The young officer left quickly, and Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders as he walked away. She made another mental note, this one about Walsh's leadership style and its impact on junior personnel. "You see what I have to deal with," Walsh said, settling back into his chair as if the interruption had somehow proven his point. These young officers come in thinking they know everything, but they lack the experience to make real decisions. They need constant guidance and supervision. Sarah nodded politely, though her thoughts were quite different. What she had witnessed wasn't leadership, but its complete absence. A competent commander would have either addressed the lieutenant's question properly or delegated authority clearly. Instead, Walsh had chosen to humiliate a subordinate while leaving important issues unresolved. "How long has Lieutenant—" Sarah began. "Peterson," Walsh supplied. "He's been here about 6 months. Typical West Point graduate. Lots of book learning, but no practical sense. They come in with these grand ideas about leadership and teamwork, but they don't understand that the military works on hierarchy and discipline." Sarah bit back her response to this comment. She knew dozens of West Point graduates who exemplified the finest traditions of military leadership. The problem wasn't with Peterson's background, but with Walsh's failure to mentor and develop his junior officers. "Perhaps we could begin that tour now," Sarah suggested, hoping that observing the base's operations might provide insight into whether Walsh's leadership failures were isolated incidents or part of a larger pattern. Walsh glanced at his watch with obvious reluctance. "I suppose we could take a quick look around. But understand that I have a conference call with division headquarters in an hour, so we'll need to keep this brief." As they left his office, Walsh adopted the kind of forced enthusiasm that Sarah recognized as performance rather than genuine pride in his command. He pointed out various administrative departments and support functions, but his descriptions were superficial and focused more on regulations and procedures than on the people who made the base function. Their first stop was the motor pool, where vehicles were being serviced and maintained. Sarah immediately noticed several problems: work areas that were disorganized, safety protocols that weren't being followed, and equipment that appeared to be in poor repair. When she pointed out a hydraulic leak that could pose both safety and environmental hazards, Walsh waved off her concern. "These mechanics know what they're doing," he said dismissively. "A little fluid on the ground isn't going to hurt anything. We're not running a pristine laboratory here. We're maintaining military vehicles under field conditions." Sarah watched as a young mechanic struggled with a heavy component while his supervisor sat in an air-conditioned booth, reading a magazine. The parallel to what she had observed at the loading dock earlier was troubling. It suggested a culture where leadership meant delegation without accountability, and where junior personnel were left to handle problems without proper support or guidance. As they continued their tour, Walsh kept up a steady stream of commentary that revealed more about his character than he probably intended. He spoke about soldiers as if they were merely resources to be managed rather than people to be led. He complained about new regulations designed to improve safety and working conditions, dismissing them as unnecessary bureaucracy. Most telling of all, he seemed completely unaware of the various problems that Sarah was documenting with each passing minute. At the dining facility, Sarah observed long lines of soldiers waiting for substandard food while the facility operated with reduced staff. When she asked about the staffing situation, Walsh's response was a shrug and a comment about making do with what we have. But Sarah could see that the real problem wasn't resources, it was prioritization. While the soldiers' dining facility struggled, she had noticed that the officers' club appeared to be fully staffed and well-maintained. The final stop on their abbreviated tour was the training facility, where Sarah expected to see the kind of professional development and skill building that should be the heart of any military installation. Instead, she found a group of soldiers sitting in folding chairs while an instructor read verbatim from a PowerPoint presentation that appeared to be several years out of date. "Our training program is second to none," Walsh proclaimed, apparently unaware of the lackluster scene playing out before them. "We maintain strict adherence to all Army training standards and requirements." Sarah watched as several soldiers in the back of the room fought to stay awake during the monotonous presentation. The instructor showed no enthusiasm for his subject and made no effort to engage his audience. This wasn't training, it was simply going through the motions to check boxes on some administrative checklist. When they returned to Walsh's office, Sarah felt as though she had seen enough to form preliminary conclusions about the base's operations. What troubled her most wasn't the specific problems she had observed. Every military installation had challenges that needed to be addressed. What concerned her was Walsh's complete inability to recognize these issues, much less take steps to resolve them. "So, Ms. Martinez," Walsh said, settling back into his chair with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had just provided an impressive demonstration. "What's your assessment of our operations?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "I've certainly observed some interesting aspects of how this base functions." "I'm sure you have," Walsh replied with a smirk. "And I'm equally sure that whatever report you write will reflect the high standards we maintain here. Though I have to say, I'm still curious about your background. It's unusual for the Pentagon to send someone so—" He paused, searching for the right word. "So inexperienced to conduct this type of evaluation." The comment stung, not because Sarah doubted her qualifications, but because it revealed the depth of Walsh's arrogance and prejudice. Throughout her career, she had encountered this attitude from officers who made assumptions based on appearance, gender, or perceived background rather than actual capability and achievement. "Colonel Walsh," Sarah said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, "I can assure you that my experience is quite relevant to this evaluation." Walsh leaned forward, his expression becoming more confrontational. "Is it? Because from where I sit, it looks like the Pentagon is wasting valuable time and resources sending unqualified personnel to assess operations they don't understand. No offense, but military command isn't something you can learn from textbooks or corporate seminars." Sarah felt a familiar surge of controlled anger, the same feeling she had experienced countless times when facing down enemy commanders or dealing with incompetent allies. But in this situation, her rank and authority remained hidden, leaving her with only her professionalism and self-control as weapons against Walsh's growing insolence. The afternoon was far from over, and Sarah realized that maintaining her cover was becoming increasingly challenging. Walsh's behavior was not only unprofessional, but potentially damaging to the soldiers under his command. The question was no longer whether she would reveal her true identity, but when and how she would choose to do so. As Walsh continued his patronizing commentary about military leadership and the challenges of command, Sarah found herself thinking about the young lieutenant who had been humiliated earlier, the mechanics working without proper supervision, and the soldiers enduring substandard conditions because their commanding officer was more concerned with appearances than actual performance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal not only Sarah's true identity, but also the vast gulf between real leadership and the hollow pretense that Colonel Walsh had mistaken for command authority. The morning's observations had been enlightening, but Sarah suspected that the afternoon would prove to be truly educational for both of them. The tension in Colonel Walsh's office had become palpable by the time they returned from their tour. Sarah could see that Walsh was growing increasingly comfortable with what he perceived as a superior position, while she found herself struggling to maintain the facade of being merely a civilian consultant. The morning's observations had revealed a pattern of poor leadership that went far beyond simple administrative oversights. "You know, Ms. Martinez," Walsh continued, settling deeper into his chair with the confidence of a man who believed himself to be in complete control of the situation, "I've been thinking about your assignment here. The Pentagon's decision to send someone like you suggests they're not taking this evaluation seriously." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me? Well, Walsh gestured vaguely in her direction. Someone with no apparent military background conducting an assessment of military operations. It's like sending a food critic to evaluate a nuclear submarine. You might be able to comment on the aesthetics, but you lack the fundamental understanding necessary to make meaningful judgments about operational effectiveness. The comparison was so absurd that Sarah almost laughed, but she maintained her composure. I see. And what exactly makes you so certain about my background, Colonel? Walsh pulled out a thin folder from his desk drawer with the theatrical flourish of someone revealing a winning hand in poker. I did my homework, Ms. Martinez. I had my staff researcher background after I received notification of this inspection. He opened the folder and began reading with obvious satisfaction. Sarah Elena Martinez, age 38, born in El Paso, Texas. Bachelor's degree in International Relations from Georgetown University, MBA from Harvard Business School. Currently employed as a management consultant specializing in organizational efficiency. He looked up with a triumphant expression. No military service record whatsoever. The closest you've come to military operations is probably watching war movies. Sarah listened to this recitation with growing amazement. The research was both accurate and completely misleading, like describing a master chef solely by listing their favorite restaurants while ignoring their culinary training and professional experience. Everything Walsh had said was technically true, but it represented perhaps 5% of her actual background. What the file apparently didn't contain was any mention of her 20 years of active duty service, her current rank as Brigadier General, her multiple combat deployments, or her current role as Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. Either Walsh's intelligence gathering was remarkably incompetent, or someone at the Pentagon had gone to considerable trouble to create a cover story that would allow her to conduct this evaluation without revealing her true identity. Interesting research, Sarah said calmly. Though I wonder if your staff might have missed some details. Walsh closed the folder with a snap. I doubt it. My intelligence officer is very thorough. The point is, Ms. Martinez, that I find it insulting to have my command evaluated by someone who has never worn the uniform, never led troops in combat, and never faced the real challenges of military leadership. Sarah felt her patience eroding rapidly. Throughout her career, she had endured skepticism, prejudice, and condescension from various sources, but Walsh's combination of arrogance and ignorance was particularly grating. The fact that he was unknowingly insulting a superior officer made his behavior even more egregious. Colonel, Sarah said, her voice taking a harder edge, perhaps we should discuss some of the specific issues I observed during our tour. By all means, Walsh replied with a dismissive wave. I'm curious to hear what problems a management consultant thinks she's identified in a military installation. Sarah pulled out a small notebook from her briefcase. She had been taking discreet notes throughout the morning. Let's start with safety protocols. I noticed several violations in the motor pool that could result in serious injuries or environmental damage. Walsh's expression didn't change, such as hydraulic fluid leaks that weren't properly contained, safety equipment that wasn't being used, and work procedures that don't meet current Army standards. Sarah flipped through her notes. I also observed a lack of proper supervision, with junior personnel handling complex maintenance tasks without adequate oversight. Ms. Martinez, Walsh said with the patient tone one might use when explaining something to a child, what you call violations are simply the realities of maintaining military vehicles under operational conditions. These aren't civilian automobiles being serviced in a pristine garage. This is military equipment being maintained by soldiers who know what they're doing. Soldiers who know what they're doing but are operating without proper leadership, Sarah countered. I watched mechanics struggle with tasks that should have been supervised and supported by senior personnel. Walsh leaned forward, his expression becoming more confrontational. Listen, lady, I don't know what kind of corporate consulting you usually do, but this isn't some office building where everyone sits around discussing optimal workflow procedures. This is the Army. We have a job to do, and we do it efficiently and effectively. The use of lady in that dismissive tone was the kind of casual disrespect that Sarah had encountered throughout her military career, usually from officers who couldn't conceive of women in positions of authority. She made a mental note to address this particular aspect of Walsh's leadership style in her eventual report. "Let's talk about the dining facility," Sarah continued, maintaining her professional demeanor despite her growing irritation. Soldiers were waiting in extremely long lines for substandard food, while the facility operated with insufficient staff. "The dining facility meets all Army nutritional and operational requirements," Walsh replied automatically. "We operate within our allocated resources and provide adequate sustenance for all personnel." "Adequate sustenance," Sarah repeated. "Is that really the standard you're striving for? Because I noticed that the officers' club appeared to be fully staffed and well-maintained while enlisted personnel were dealing with significant delays and poor food quality." Walsh's face flushed slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. "The officers' club operates under a different budget allocation. That's not a command decision. That's how the system is structured. But prioritizing resources and ensuring equitable treatment of all personnel under your command, those are command decisions," Sarah pressed. "A leader's responsibility is to advocate for their soldiers' welfare, not to accept systemic problems as inevitable." "Don't lecture me about leadership," Walsh snapped, his composure finally beginning to slip. "You have no idea what it takes to command a military installation. Every decision I make has to balance dozens of competing priorities and constraints that you couldn't possibly understand." Sarah set down her notebook and looked directly at Walsh. "Then, help me understand. Explain to me how allowing enlisted personnel to endure substandard conditions while maintaining superior amenities for officers represents effective leadership." Walsh stood up abruptly, clearly agitated by the direction of the conversation. "You want to know about leadership? Leadership is making hard choices with incomplete information and limited resources. It's about maintaining discipline and standards even when everyone around you is looking for shortcuts. It's about responsibility for outcomes that you can't always control." "I agree," Sarah said quietly. "Leadership is about all of those things. But it's also about taking care of your people, setting the right example, and being accountable for the culture you create within your command." "Culture?" Walsh laughed harshly. "Ms. Martinez, this isn't some Silicon Valley startup where we worry about employee satisfaction surveys. This is the military. Our culture is discipline, hierarchy, and mission accomplishment. Everything else is secondary." Sarah shook her head. "Actually, Colonel, military culture should be about much more than that. It should be about honor, integrity, and service before self. It should be about developing leaders at every level and creating an environment where people can perform at their best." Walsh returned to his seat, but his body language remained tense and defensive. "Those are nice ideals, but they don't always translate to practical command decisions. Sometimes you have to prioritize efficiency over popularity." "I'm not talking about popularity," Sarah replied. "I'm talking about effectiveness. The issues I observed this morning: poor safety practices, inadequate supervision, low morale among junior personnel. These things reduce operational effectiveness. They don't improve it." "Low morale?" Walsh scoffed. "Where did you get that impression? My soldiers are disciplined and professional. They follow orders and complete their missions." "Following orders isn't the same as having good morale," Sarah explained. "I watched your interaction with Lieutenant Peterson earlier. That young officer was clearly trying to handle a situation properly, but instead of guidance or support, you humiliated him in front of a visitor." Walsh's face darkened. "Lieutenant Peterson needs to learn to solve problems independently instead of running to his commanding officer for every minor issue. That's how you develop leadership skills." "That's not how you develop leadership skills," Sarah said firmly. "You develop leadership by mentoring, by providing clear guidance, and by creating an environment where people feel supported and taking appropriate initiative." What I witnessed was a senior officer destroying a junior officer's confidence for no constructive purpose. You don't know what you're talking about, Walsh shot back. I've been developing military leaders for years. My methods have produced results. What results? Sarah asked. Because what I see is an installation with systemic problems, low morale, and a command climate that stifles rather than develops junior leaders. Walsh slammed his hand on the desk, causing several items to jump. Enough. I don't have to sit here and listen to some civilian contractor who's never been responsible for anything more important than a quarterly profit report tell me how to command military personnel. The outburst revealed more about Walsh's character than he probably realized. A confident, competent leader would have either addressed her concerns constructively or calmly explained why her observations were incorrect. Instead, Walsh had resorted to personal attacks and appeals to authority that he didn't actually possess, at least not in relation to Sarah. Sarah remained calm despite Walsh's emotional display. "Colonel, I understand that criticism can be difficult to hear, especially from someone you perceive as an outsider. But these observations aren't personal attacks. They're professional assessments based on recognized leadership principles." Professional assessments? Walsh's voice rose again. From someone whose idea of leadership probably comes from business school case studies? Do you think you could just walk in here with your theories and PowerPoint presentations and tell experienced military officers how to do their jobs? I think, Sarah said carefully, that good leadership principles are universal, whether you're in the military, in business, or in any other organization where people depend on you to make the right decisions. Walsh leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from anger to something approaching contempt. "You know what your problem is, Ms. Martinez? You think leadership is about being nice to people and making everyone feel good about themselves. But real leadership, military leadership, sometimes requires you to be the bad guy. Sometimes you have to make people do things they don't want to do." "I don't think leadership is about being nice," Sarah replied. "I think it's about being effective and humiliating subordinates, ignoring systemic problems, and creating a culture of fear isn't effective leadership. It's poor management disguised as toughness." Walsh shook his head in apparent disbelief. "This is exactly what's wrong with the modern military. Everyone wants to psychoanalyze every decision and worry about people's feelings instead of focusing on mission accomplishment. We're warriors, not therapists." "Those aren't mutually exclusive concepts," Sarah said. "The best military leaders throughout history have understood that taking care of your people and accomplishing the mission go hand in hand. Soldiers will follow a leader they trust and respect much further than they'll follow someone they fear. Trust and respect are earned through competence and results," Walsh replied, "not through popularity contests and sensitivity training." Sarah nodded. "I agree completely. Trust and respect are earned through competence. That's exactly my point." The implication hung in the air between them, and Sarah could see Walsh struggling to decide whether she had just insulted him or simply made an obvious observation. His uncertainty was revealing. A confident leader would have known the difference. At that moment, Walsh's phone rang, providing a welcome interruption to the increasingly tense conversation. He answered it with obvious relief, and Sarah used the opportunity to review her notes and consider her next approach. As Walsh talked, Sarah reflected on the morning's events and the conversation they just had. Walsh's behavior was worse than she had initially suspected. Not only was he failing to provide effective leadership, but he seemed genuinely unable to recognize his own shortcomings. His defensive responses to constructive criticism and his dismissive attitude toward his subordinates suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of what military leadership actually required. More concerning was his obvious prejudice against her perceived background and gender. Throughout their interaction, Walsh had made assumptions about her capabilities based on superficial characteristics rather than engaging with her observations on their merits. This kind of bias wasn't just unprofessional. It was dangerous in a military context where effective leadership could literally be a matter of life and death. When Walsh finished his call, He turned back to Sarah with renewed composure, apparently hoping that the interruption had reset the dynamic between them. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut our meeting short," he said, though his tone suggested relief rather than regret. "I have a conference call with division headquarters that can't be postponed." Sarah checked her watch. "Of course. But I should mention that I'll be staying on base for several more days to complete my evaluation. I'd like to continue our discussion tomorrow, if possible." Walsh's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Several days?" "I was under the impression this was a brief assessment." "Thorough evaluations require thorough observation," Sarah replied. "I'll need time to interview personnel at various levels, review operational procedures, and observe daily routines without the kind of guided tour that might not reflect normal operations." "I see." Walsh was clearly unhappy with this news, but he was trapped by his earlier claims about the installation's efficiency and effectiveness. To object too strongly would contradict his own assertions about having nothing to hide. "I trust that won't be a problem?" Sarah asked innocently. "Of course not," Walsh replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'll have someone arrange quarters for you in the visiting officer's quarters." "Thank you," Sarah said, gathering her materials. "I look forward to continuing our conversation tomorrow." As she prepared to leave, Walsh made one final attempt to reassert his perceived superiority. "Ms. Martinez, I hope you'll keep in mind that military operations are complex undertakings that can't always be understood through civilian perspectives. What might look like problems to an outsider are often simply the realities of military life." Sarah paused at the door and turned back to face him. "Colonel, I appreciate your concern about my perspective, but I can assure you that I have a very clear understanding of military realities." With that, she left Walsh's office, leaving him to contemplate her words and wonder exactly what she had meant by that final comment. As Sarah walked down the corridor, she found herself thinking about the next phase of her evaluation and the growing certainty that Colonel Walsh's command had serious problems that went well beyond the surface issues she had observed. The afternoon was young, and Sarah had work to do. She needed to conduct interviews with junior officers and enlisted personnel, review official reports and documentation, and gather the kind of comprehensive information that would allow her to make informed recommendations about the installation's future. But she also knew that her interactions with Walsh were far from over, and that the most challenging conversations still lay ahead. As she stepped outside into the afternoon heat, Sarah made a decision that would have profound consequences for everyone involved. She would continue her evaluation exactly as planned, maintaining her cover and gathering information through direct observation and interviews. But she would also begin documenting Walsh's behavior and leadership failures with the kind of precision and detail that would be necessary for the eventual reckoning that was becoming increasingly inevitable. Colonel Walsh had made it clear that he had no respect for her perceived qualifications or her right to evaluate his command. Soon, very soon, he would discover just how wrong he had been about both. The visiting officers' quarters were Spartan, but adequate, reflecting the practical mindset that governed most aspects of military life. Sarah had spent countless nights in similar accommodations during her career, from forward operating bases in Afghanistan to temporary assignments at installations across the globe. The familiar environment actually brought her comfort as she settled in for what would likely be several challenging days. After securing her belongings and changing into more comfortable clothes, Sarah decided to begin the real work of her evaluation. Her confrontation with Colonel Walsh had been enlightening, but it represented only one perspective on the installation's operations. To form a complete assessment, she needed to hear from the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and junior officers who actually carried out the daily missions that kept the base functioning. Her first stop was the enlisted dining facility, where she hoped to observe interactions and possibly engage in casual conversations with personnel during the afternoon meal. As she approached the building, Sarah noticed that the long lines from the morning had been replaced by a more manageable flow of people, though the overall atmosphere remained less than inspiring. Inside, she selected a simple meal and found a seat at a table where she could observe without being too conspicuous. The dining hall was about half full, with small groups of soldiers engaged in the kind of conversations that revealed more about morale and unit cohesion than any formal survey ever could. At the table next to her, 3 young enlisted personnel were discussing their work assignments with the kind of frustration that Sarah recognized as symptomatic of poor leadership and unclear expectations. One of them, a specialist with intelligent eyes and careful speech patterns, was explaining to his colleagues why a recent training exercise had been unnecessarily complicated and ultimately ineffective. The whole thing was just for show, he was saying. Sergeant Williams told us from the beginning that we weren't actually supposed to learn anything. We just had to make sure we looked good for the inspection team that was supposed to come through. But the inspection team never showed up, added another soldier, a young woman with corporal stripes who spoke with the weary tone of someone who had seen too many meaningless exercises. Exactly, the specialist continued. So we spent 3 days practicing procedures we'll never use, learning nothing about procedures we actually need to know. Also, some colonel could check a box on his efficiency report. Sarah listened to this exchange with growing concern. What these soldiers were describing wasn't just poor training management. It was a fundamental corruption of the military's educational mission. Training was supposed to prepare personnel for real-world challenges, not to create the appearance of readiness for administrative purposes. When the soldiers at the neighboring table got up to leave, Sarah followed them outside and introduced herself as a consultant working on operational efficiency. They were initially wary. Military personnel had learned through experience to be cautious about sharing opinions with civilians who might report back to their chain of command. But Sarah's genuine interest and careful questions eventually encouraged them to open up. The picture that emerged from her conversations was deeply troubling. According to these soldiers, Colonel Walsh's leadership had created a culture where appearance mattered more than substance, where junior personnel were discouraged from raising legitimate concerns, and where career advancement depended more on political awareness than professional competence. Specialist James Rodriguez, the soldier she had overheard in the dining facility, was particularly articulate about the problems facing junior enlisted personnel under Walsh's command. "Ma'am," he explained as they walked toward the training facility, "it's not that we don't want to do our jobs well. It's that we're not allowed to do our jobs well. Everything has to be done exactly the way Colonel Walsh wants it done, even when his way doesn't make sense." Rodriguez gave her a specific example from the previous month, when their unit had been tasked with implementing new safety protocols for vehicle maintenance. The protocols were designed to reduce accidents and improve efficiency, but Walsh had insisted on modifications that actually made the procedures more dangerous and time-consuming. When Sergeant Martinez tried to explain why the colonel's changes were problematic, he was told to implement them anyway or face disciplinary action, Rodriguez continued. 3 weeks later, we had a serious accident that could have been prevented if we'd been allowed to follow the original protocols. Sarah made careful mental notes about this incident, knowing that she would need to review the official documentation to understand the full scope of what had happened. But Rodriguez's account was consistent with what she had observed about Walsh's leadership style, a combination of arrogance and insecurity that led him to reject input from subordinates, even when that input was based on expertise he didn't possess. Corporal Lisa Chun, the other soldier from the dining facility, shared similar concerns about the training programs under Walsh's supervision. "The problem isn't that we're not getting trained," she explained. "It's that we're getting trained on the wrong things, or we're getting good training that gets undermined by poor implementation." Chun described a leadership development program that had been designed to prepare junior enlisted personnel for increased responsibilities. The curriculum was excellent, developed by experts who understood both military requirements and adult learning principles. But Walsh had insisted on modifications that turned interactive workshops into lecture-style presentations and had replaced experienced instructors with officers who lacked both teaching skills and subject matter expertise. By the time Colonel Walsh finished improving the program, it was basically useless, Chin said. "We spent 40 hours learning things we already knew, taught by people who knew less about the subject than we did. Meanwhile, the skills we actually needed to develop, critical thinking, problem-solving, communication, those got ignored completely. As Sarah continued her conversations with junior personnel throughout the afternoon, a clear pattern emerged. Walsh's leadership failures weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic approach that prioritized control over competence, appearance over effectiveness, and personal authority over mission accomplishment. Perhaps most disturbing were the stories about how Walsh dealt with personnel who questioned his decisions or suggested alternative approaches. According to multiple sources, he had a pattern of retaliating against soldiers and junior officers who challenged his authority, even when their challenges were professional and constructive. Lieutenant Jennifer Morrison, whom Sarah met during a chance encounter at the base exchange, provided a particularly illuminating example of Walsh's vindictive leadership style. Morrison was a bright young officer with a background in logistics and supply chain management, skills that should have made her invaluable in her current assignment overseeing the base's procurement operations. I made the mistake of suggesting improvements to our inventory management system, Morrison explained as they walked through the PX. I had identified several inefficiencies that were costing us both time and money, and I prepared a detailed proposal for addressing them. According to Morrison, Walsh's response to her proposal had been swift and devastating. Rather than evaluating her suggestions on their merits, he had accused her of insubordination and questioning his competence. He had then reassigned her to duties that made no use of her expertise and had blocked her from attending professional development opportunities that would have enhanced her value to the military. The worst part, Morrison continued, is that the problems I identified are still there. We're still wasting resources and operating inefficiently, but now everyone knows what happens to people who try to fix things. So the problems just get worse. Sarah found Morrison's story particularly troubling because it represented exactly the kind of leadership failure that could have far-reaching consequences. Military organizations depended on junior officers like Morrison to identify problems and propose solutions. When commanders discouraged or punished such initiative, they didn't just harm individual careers, they degraded the organization's ability to adapt and improve. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's informal interviews painted an increasingly disturbing picture of life under Walsh's command. She heard stories of training programs that existed only on paper, of safety violations that were ignored or covered up, and of personnel decisions that seemed designed to consolidate Walsh's power rather than improve operational effectiveness. But she also discovered something that gave her hope for the installation's future. Despite Walsh's poor leadership, the junior personnel she spoke with remained dedicated to their missions and committed to serving their country effectively. They had found ways to work around their commanding officers' limitations, creating informal networks of support and information sharing that allowed them to accomplish their duties despite systematic obstacles. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, a senior NCO with 15 years of experience, explained how the base's non-commissioned officers had developed their own leadership development program to compensate for the inadequacies of the official training. We meet after hours on our own time to share knowledge and mentor younger soldiers, he told Sarah. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. Torres' description of the NCO initiative revealed both the dedication of the personnel and the depth of the leadership vacuum at the top. When senior enlisted personnel felt compelled to create unofficial programs to meet training needs, it indicated a fundamental failure in the command structure. The thing is, Torres continued, most of us have served under good commanders before. We know what that looks like. So when we get a commander who doesn't understand leadership, we try to make the best of it while hoping for better next time. Sarah appreciated Torres' diplomatic language, but she also understood what he was really saying. The base's senior NCOs were essentially running a shadow command structure, providing the leadership and guidance that should have been coming from the official chain of command. It was a testament to their professionalism, but it was also an indictment of Walsh's failure to fulfill his responsibilities. As evening approached, Sarah realized that she had gathered enough information to form preliminary conclusions about the installation's problems. But she also knew that the most difficult part of her evaluation still lay ahead. Tomorrow, she would need to continue her observations while preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Walsh that would reveal her true identity and authority. The decision about when and how to reveal herself was becoming increasingly complex. On one hand, maintaining her cover was allowing her to gather unfiltered information about the base's operations and culture. On the other hand, every day that Walsh remained in command was another day that dedicated soldiers and officers suffered under poor leadership. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing her notes and considering her options. She had documented numerous examples of leadership failures, policy violations, and organizational dysfunction. But she had also seen evidence of the resilience and dedication that made the military special, even under difficult circumstances. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she recognized, her immediate superior at the Pentagon. General Martinez, the voice on the other end said, using her correct title for the first time in 2 days. "How is your evaluation proceeding?" Sarah had been expecting this call. "It's proceeding well, sir, though I suspect the next few days will be quite interesting. I've been hearing some informal reports about your interactions with Colonel Walsh," her superior continued. "Without going into details, I want you to know that you have my complete support for whatever actions you deem necessary." The conversation was brief, but reassuring. Sarah's mission had always been to assess the installation's effectiveness and recommend necessary changes. But now she had confirmation that she also had the authority to take immediate action if she determined that the situation required urgent intervention. After ending the call, Sarah returned to her notes and began drafting the preliminary report that would eventually document her findings and recommendations. As she wrote, she found herself thinking about the soldiers and officers she had met during her first day of evaluation. People like Rodriguez, Chun, Morrison, and Torres, who deserved better leadership than they were receiving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new revelations. Sarah planned to continue her interviews and observations, focusing particularly on the installation's operational procedures and safety protocols. She also intended to have another conversation with Colonel Walsh, one that might require her to make some difficult decisions about how much longer to maintain her cover. But tonight, as she prepared for sleep in the familiar surroundings of military quarters, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that had driven her throughout her career. She had joined the military to serve her country and protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes that meant facing enemy forces in combat. Sometimes it meant confronting incompetent leaders who were failing in their duties to the soldiers under their command. Tomorrow, Colonel Walsh would discover that his dismissive treatment of a supposed civilian consultant had actually been disrespectful behavior toward a superior officer with the authority to end his career. But more importantly, the soldiers and officers serving under his command would learn that their concerns had been heard and that help was on the way. Sarah turned off the light and settled in for what she knew would be her last night of anonymity. Tomorrow, everything would change for Walsh, for the installation, and for the dedicated military personnel who deserved the kind of leadership that would allow them to serve their country with the excellence they were capable of achieving. Dawn came early to the military base, announced by the familiar sound of reveille echoing across the compound. Sarah had been awake for an hour already, reviewing her notes from the previous day and preparing for what she knew would be the most crucial phase of her evaluation. Today, she planned to dig deeper into the installation's operational records, conduct more formal interviews with key personnel, and ultimately make the decision about when to reveal her true identity to Colonel Walsh. After a quick breakfast at the enlisted dining facility, where she observed the same substandard conditions and poor morale she had noted the day before, Sarah made her way to the administrative building. Her first appointment was with the base's senior enlisted advisor, Command Sergeant Major Robert Hayes, a career soldier whose reputation for integrity and competence had preceded him. Hayes was a man in his early 50s with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades of service in challenging environments. His office was modest but organized, decorated with unit citations and photographs that told the story of a distinguished military career. When Sarah introduced herself, he greeted her with the professional courtesy that senior NCOs extended to all visitors. But she could see the wariness in his eyes. "Sergeant Major," Sarah began, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. I'm conducting an evaluation of this installation's operational effectiveness, and I'm particularly interested in your perspective as the senior enlisted leader." Hayes nodded carefully. "I'm happy to help, ma'am, though I should mention that Colonel Walsh asked me to remind any interviewees that all comments should reflect positively on the installation and its leadership." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Did he really? And what's your opinion of that guidance?" For the first time, Hayes allowed a slight smile to cross his face. "Ma'am, in my 28 years of military service, I've learned that there's a big difference between loyalty and dishonesty. I'll give you my honest assessment, but I'll also be professional in how I present it." Over the next hour, Hayes provided Sarah with the most comprehensive and insightful analysis she had yet received about the installation's problems. As the senior enlisted advisor, he was in a unique position to understand how command decisions affected day-to-day operations and personnel welfare. His observations confirmed and expanded upon many of the issues Sarah had identified during her initial assessment. The fundamental problem, Hayes explained, is that Colonel Walsh doesn't understand the difference between command and leadership. He thinks that having authority means he's automatically effective, but authority without competence and respect is just tyranny with a uniform. Hayes described specific incidents where Walsh's poor decisions had created serious problems for the installation. There was the time he had overridden safety protocols because he thought they were unnecessary, resulting in a serious accident that could have been fatal. There was his decision to cancel important training exercises because he needed personnel for a ceremonial function that existed solely to impress visiting dignitaries. Most troubling of all was his systematic retaliation against personnel who questioned his decisions, even when their concerns were legitimate and professionally presented. "The junior officers are particularly affected," Hayes continued. "They come here eager to learn and contribute, but Colonel Walsh treats them like potential threats rather than valuable resources. Lieutenant Peterson, for example, he's one of the most promising young officers I've worked with, but the colonel has undermined his confidence to the point where he's considering leaving the military entirely." Sarah remembered her observation of Walsh's treatment of Peterson the previous day. What specifically happened with Lieutenant Peterson? Hayes sighed deeply before responding. "Peterson identified a serious flaw in our emergency response procedures, a gap that could have cost lives if we'd faced a real crisis. He researched the issue thoroughly, consulted with experts, and developed a comprehensive solution. When he presented it to Colonel Walsh, the colonel accused him of overstepping his authority and questioning superior judgment. What happened to Peterson's proposal? It was rejected without consideration," Hayes replied. 3 weeks later, we had a minor emergency that exposed exactly the flaw Peterson had identified. We were lucky it wasn't more serious, but the colonel still refuses to acknowledge that Peterson was right. Sarah made detailed notes about this incident, knowing that it represented a perfect example of how Walsh's leadership failures could have life and death consequences. A competent commander would have welcomed Peterson's initiative and implemented his recommendations. Walsh's rejection of valuable input based on personal pride rather than merit evaluation was inexcusable. As their conversation continued, Hayes painted a picture of an installation where dedicated personnel were struggling to maintain standards despite systematic obstacles created by their commanding officer. The senior NCOs were working overtime to compensate for poor leadership at the top. Junior officers were becoming demoralized and considering leaving military service, and enlisted personnel were losing confidence in the chain of command. The tragedy, Hayes concluded, is that this could be an outstanding installation, We have excellent facilities, dedicated personnel, and important missions. But we're operating at maybe 60% of our potential because leadership failures are preventing us from achieving what we're capable of. After her meeting with Hayes, Sarah spent the morning reviewing official documentation in the base's administrative offices. What she found in the files confirmed many of the concerns that had been raised during her interviews. Incident reports showed a pattern of safety violations and procedural failures. Training records revealed gaps between required standards and actual implementation. Personnel evaluations suggested systemic problems with morale and retention. Most damning of all were the reports that Walsh had submitted to higher headquarters. These documents painted a picture of an installation operating at peak efficiency, with high morale and exemplary performance in all areas. The disconnect between Walsh's official reports and the reality Sarah had observed was so dramatic that it bordered on falsification of official documents. At noon, Sarah received a message asking her to report to Colonel Walsh's office for a follow-up meeting. As she made her way through the corridors of the administrative building, she reflected on how much her understanding of the situation had evolved since her arrival. What had initially appeared to be isolated problems with leadership style had revealed themselves as systematic failures that threatened the installation's mission and the welfare of its personnel. Walsh was waiting for her in his office, but his demeanor had changed significantly since their previous meeting. Gone was the confident arrogance he had displayed the day before, replaced by a barely concealed anxiety that suggested he was beginning to understand that his evaluation might not proceed as smoothly as he had anticipated. "Ms. Martinez," he began, his voice tight with forced professionalism, "I trust you've had an opportunity to complete your assessment of our operations?" "I've made significant progress," Sarah replied, taking the seat across from his desk, "though I still have more work to do before I can finalize my conclusions." Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I've been hearing reports that you've been conducting unauthorized interviews with personnel at various levels. I should remind you that any evaluation of this installation should be coordinated through my office to ensure accuracy and completeness." Sarah looked at him steadily. "Colonel, are you suggesting that I should only speak with personnel you've pre-selected?" "I'm suggesting that informal conversations with junior personnel might give you a skewed perspective on our operations," Walsh replied. "Soldiers sometimes have limited understanding of the bigger picture, and they might share complaints or concerns that don't reflect the reality of command decisions." "I see," Sarah said. "And what would you consider an accurate perspective on your command effectiveness?" Walsh launched into a prepared presentation that covered statistics on mission completion rates, budget management, and personnel readiness. Everything he said was technically accurate, but it was also misleading in the way that statistics often were when divorced from context and human impact. "Our mission completion rate is 97%, Walsh concluded proudly. "Our budget variance is less than 2%, and our personnel readiness scores exceed Army standards in every category." Sarah nodded politely. "Those are impressive numbers, Colonel, but I'm curious about some specific incidents that seem to contradict the picture those statistics paint." She began describing the incidents she had documented during her evaluation, watching Walsh's expression grow increasingly uncomfortable as she revealed the depth of her knowledge about his command's problems. When she mentioned Lieutenant Peterson's emergency response proposal and its subsequent rejection, Walsh's face flushed with anger. "Who told you about that?" he demanded. "That information is supposed to be confidential." "Colonel," Sarah replied calmly, "personnel under your command have legitimate concerns about safety and operational effectiveness. Those concerns become my concerns when I'm evaluating this installation." Walsh stood up abruptly and began pacing behind his desk. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You've been here less than 2 days, and you're already stirring up trouble by encouraging junior personnel to criticize their chain of command." "I haven't encouraged anyone to do anything," Sarah said firmly. "I've simply asked questions and listened to the answers. If those answers reflect poorly on your leadership, that's something you need to address rather than blame the messenger." "Leadership?" Walsh's voice rose to near shouting level. Don't talk to me about leadership. I've been commanding military personnel since before you knew what the Army was. I don't need some civilian consultant with her fancy degrees telling me how to lead soldiers. Sarah felt her patience finally reach its breaking point. Throughout her career, she had endured disrespect and condescension from various sources, but Walsh's combination of arrogance, incompetence, and willful blindness to his own failures was intolerable. More importantly, his poor leadership was harming the soldiers and officers under his command, people who deserved better from their commanding officer. "Colonel Walsh," Sarah said, her voice taking on the command tone that had been absent during their previous interactions, "you need to sit down and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." There was something in her tone that penetrated Walsh's anger and forced him to pay attention. He stopped pacing and looked at her with sudden uncertainty. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a leather folder that she had kept carefully concealed since her arrival. From it, she extracted a military identification card and a set of orders that she placed on Walsh's desk. "My name is Brigadier General Sarah Elena Martinez," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I am the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, United States Army, and I am conducting this evaluation under direct orders from the Pentagon." The color drained from Walsh's face as he picked up her identification and orders, his hands trembling slightly as he read the documents that revealed the true scope of his situation. The woman he had been dismissing as an unqualified civilian consultant was actually a superior officer with the authority to end his military career. "Ma'am," Walsh began, his voice barely above a whisper, I didn't know." "No, Colonel, you didn't know," Sarah replied, her tone stern but controlled. "And the reason you didn't know is because you were too busy making assumptions based on prejudice and arrogance to conduct proper intelligence gathering. A competent officer would have verified my identity and credentials before making the kind of dismissive comments you've been making for the past 2 days." Walsh sank into his chair, the full weight of his situation beginning to dawn on him. Everything he had said about her background, every dismissive comment about her qualifications, every condescending remark about civilian consultants, all of it had been directed at a general officer who outranked him and had the authority to destroy his career. "General Martinez," Walsh said, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic, "I apologize for any misunderstanding. If I had known your true identity, if you had known my true identity, you would have treated me with respect," Sarah finished. "But, Colonel, that's exactly the problem. Respect shouldn't be based solely on rank or position. It should be based on professional courtesy and human decency. The way you've treated me reflects the way you treat everyone you perceive as having less authority than you do." Sarah stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the base's main courtyard, where soldiers were going about their daily duties. "Those people out there deserve better leadership than what you've been providing. They deserve a commanding officer who listens to their concerns, who values their input, and who puts their welfare ahead of his own ego." When she turned back to face Walsh, she saw a broken man struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his failure. But she also saw someone who might finally be ready to acknowledge the damage his poor leadership had caused. "General," Walsh said desperately, "please give me a chance to explain. There are complexities to command that you might not understand." Sarah cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. "Colonel Walsh, I have commanded troops in combat zones across 3 continents. I have led special operations missions behind enemy lines. I have been responsible for the lives and welfare of thousands of soldiers in situations where failure meant death. Do not presume to lecture me about the complexities of command." The revelation of her true background and authority had shifted the dynamic between them completely. Walsh was no longer dealing with a civilian consultant whose opinions he could dismiss. He was facing a superior officer whose evaluation would determine his future in the military and who had already documented enough evidence of his failures to justify immediate removal from command. But Sarah's goal wasn't simply to destroy Walsh's career. It was to fix the problems that were harming the soldiers and officers under his command. The question now was whether Walsh was capable of acknowledging his failures and taking steps to address them, or whether his removal from command was the only solution that would serve the best interests of the installation and its personnel. The afternoon was far from over, and the most crucial conversations still lay ahead. Walsh's reaction to the revelation of Sarah's identity would determine not only his own fate, but also the future of everyone serving under his command. The silence in Colonel Walsh's office stretched for what felt like an eternity as he stared at the identification and orders that had shattered his understanding of the previous 2 days. Sarah watched his face cycle through a range of emotions: shock, fear, anger, and, finally, a kind of desperate calculation as he tried to determine if there was any way to salvage his career from the wreckage of his own arrogance. "General Martinez," Walsh finally managed, his voice hoarse with strain, I need you to understand that everything I've done has been in the best interests of this installation and its mission. Sarah returned to her seat, her posture and expression now reflecting the authority that she had kept hidden for 2 days. "Colonel, let's be very clear about something. I'm not interested in excuses or justifications. I'm interested in facts. And the facts I've documented paint a very disturbing picture of your command." She opened her notebook and began reading from her observations, each item a precise indictment of Walsh's leadership failures. Safety violations in the motor pool that you dismissed as normal operational conditions. Training programs that exist only on paper while soldiers receive inadequate preparation for their missions. Retaliation against personnel who identify problems and propose solutions. A complete disconnect between your official reports and the actual conditions on this base. With each point, Walsh seemed to shrink further into his chair. The confident officer who had lectured her about military leadership just days before had been replaced by a man who was beginning to comprehend the true scope of his professional failures. "But perhaps most troubling," Sarah continued, "is the systematic way you've undermined the development of junior leaders. Officers like Lieutenant Peterson, who should be learning and growing under your guidance, are instead being discouraged from taking initiative or contributing ideas. You're not just failing in your current responsibilities. You're damaging the future of the military by destroying the confidence and potential of the next generation of leaders." Walsh's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water on his desk. "General, I know it might appear that way from an outside perspective, but military leadership sometimes requires making unpopular decisions. Sometimes you have to be firm with subordinates to maintain discipline and order. There's a difference between firm leadership and destructive micromanagement," Sarah replied sharply. "There's a difference between maintaining standards and crushing initiative. And there's a difference between making unpopular but necessary decisions and making poor decisions based on personal pride and insecurity." Sarah stood up and walked to Walsh's wall of awards and commendations, studying them with the eye of someone who understood what military decorations actually meant. Many of Walsh's awards were legitimate achievements that reflected competent service in his earlier career. But there were also awards that seemed designed more for appearance than substance, the kind of ribbons that ambitious officers accumulated through political maneuvering rather than genuine accomplishment. "You know what I find most tragic about this situation, Colonel?" Sarah said without turning around. "You actually have the background and experience to be an effective commander. Your service record shows periods of genuine achievement and competent leadership. Somehow, though, you've lost sight of what made you successful in the past." When she turned back to face him, Sarah saw something unexpected in Walsh's eyes. Not just fear or anger, but what appeared to be genuine confusion and perhaps even a flicker of self-awareness. "I don't understand," Walsh said quietly. "I've followed all the regulations. I've met all the quantitative standards. My efficiency reports have been consistently positive." Sarah nodded sadly. "That's exactly the problem, Colonel. You've been focused on metrics and appearances instead of substance and impact. You've been managing instead of leading, controlling instead of developing, and protecting your image instead of serving your people. She returned to her seat and leaned forward, her expression softening slightly as she shifted from judge to mentor. Tell me about your first command, Colonel. Tell me about the first time you were responsible for soldiers' lives and welfare. The questions seemed to catch Walsh off guard, and for a moment his defensive facade cracked, revealing the younger officer he had once been. It was a company in Germany, he said slowly. I was a captain, and I had about 120 soldiers under my command. Most of them were just kids, really 18 and 19 years old, away from home for the first time. What did you learn from that experience? Walsh was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him struggling with memories and emotions he had apparently buried under years of career ambition and institutional politics. I learned that leadership was about more than giving orders, he said finally. Those soldiers needed guidance, support, and someone who cared about their welfare. They needed to know that their commander would make decisions based on what was best for them and the mission, not what was best for his career. And what happened to that officer? Sarah asked gently. What happened to the captain who understood that leadership was about service to others? Walsh's composure finally broke completely, and Sarah watched as 20 years of accumulated pride and defensiveness crumbled away, leaving behind a man who was finally confronting the reality of what he had become. Tears began streaming down his face as he struggled to find words for the realization that was overwhelming him. I don't know, he whispered. Somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about the soldiers and started thinking about my next promotion. I stopped asking what was right and started asking what would look good on my efficiency report. I became everything I used to despise about senior officers. The admission was painful to witness, but it was also the first genuine moment of honesty that Walsh had displayed since Sarah's arrival. For the first time, he was acknowledging the gap between his responsibilities and his performance, between the leader he should have been and the manager he had actually become. Sarah allowed the silence to stretch, giving Walsh time to process his emotions and begin coming to terms with the reality of his situation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a compassion that had been absent during their previous confrontations. Colonel, the question now is whether you're willing to do the hard work necessary to become the leader your soldiers deserve. Change is possible, but it requires genuine commitment to putting their welfare ahead of your ego. Walsh looked up at her with something approaching hope in his eyes. General, is there any chance? Is there any way I can fix this? Sarah had been dreading this moment throughout her evaluation. Her mission was to assess the installation's effectiveness and recommend necessary changes, but she also had the authority to make immediate personnel decisions if she determined that the situation required urgent intervention. Walsh's behavior had been so egregious that removal from command was clearly justified, but his apparent moment of genuine recognition offered the possibility of an alternative approach. That depends on several factors, Sarah replied carefully. It depends on your willingness to acknowledge the full scope of the problems you've created. It depends on your commitment to making immediate and substantive changes to your leadership approach. And it depends on whether you can regain the trust and respect of the personnel under your command. Over the next hour, Sarah outlined a comprehensive plan for addressing the installation's problems. Some issues required immediate attention. Safety violations that could result in injuries, training deficiencies that left personnel unprepared for their missions, and administrative problems that were affecting morale and efficiency. Other problems would require longer-term solutions. Walsh would need to undergo intensive leadership training and mentoring. He would need to apologize publicly to personnel he had mistreated and take concrete steps to restore their confidence in the chain of command. Most importantly, he would need to demonstrate through consistent actions that he had genuinely changed his approach to command. This won't be easy, Colonel, Sarah warned. You'll be under intense scrutiny for the foreseeable future. Every decision you make, every interaction you have with subordinates, every policy you implement, all of it will be evaluated to determine whether you've truly learned from this experience. Walsh nodded eagerly, apparently willing to accept any conditions that would allow him to remain in command. "I understand, General. I'm ready to do whatever it takes." "I hope you are," Sarah replied, though her tone suggested significant skepticism. "Because the alternative is immediate relief from command and probable early retirement. The choice is yours, but you need to understand that this is your last opportunity to demonstrate that you deserve to wear the uniform." As they worked through the details of the rehabilitation plan, Sarah found herself thinking about the soldiers and officers who would be most affected by her decision. Lieutenant Peterson, who needed encouragement rather than discouragement. Sergeant Major Hayes, who had been working overtime to compensate for poor leadership. Specialist Rodriguez and Corporal Chun, who deserved commanders who valued their contributions and supported their development. The decision to give Walsh another chance was risky, but Sarah believed it was justified by his apparent recognition of his failures and his express commitment to change. More importantly, removing him from command immediately would create disruption and uncertainty that might ultimately harm the very people she was trying to help. But Sarah also knew that her decision would require careful monitoring and follow-up. She arranged for regular check-ins with key personnel, established clear metrics for measuring improvement, and put systems in place that would allow for rapid intervention if Walsh reverted to his previous behavior. As the afternoon drew to a close, Sarah prepared to meet with the senior staff to explain the changes that would be implemented immediately and to begin the process of rebuilding trust and confidence throughout the installation. The revelation of her true identity would send shockwaves through the base, but it would also signal that their concerns had been heard and that help was available. Walsh accompanied her to the conference room, where his senior staff was already assembled, their faces showing confusion about the purpose of the meeting. As Sarah entered the room, she could see recognition dawning on the faces of those who had interacted with her during her evaluation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh began, his voice shaky but determined, "I need to introduce you to Brigadier General Sarah Martinez, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, United States Army." General Martinez has been conducting an evaluation of our installation, and she has some important information to share with all of us. The room erupted in surprised murmurs as the staff realized that the civilian consultant they had been observing for 2 days was actually a general officer. Sarah watched their faces carefully, noting the relief in the eyes of those who had shared their concerns with her and the apprehension of those who might have been complicit in the problems she had identified. "Thank you, Colonel Walsh," Sarah said, taking control of the meeting with the natural authority that came from years of command experience. "I want to begin by acknowledging the dedication and professionalism that I've observed from the personnel at this installation. Despite significant challenges, you've continued to accomplish your missions and serve your country with honor." She went on to outline her findings, focusing on both the problems that needed immediate attention and the strengths that could be built upon. Her tone was firm but constructive, making it clear that changes were necessary while also expressing confidence in the staff's ability to implement those changes. "The next few weeks will be challenging," Sarah concluded, "but they also represent an opportunity to create the kind of installation that reflects the best traditions of military service. I expect every one of you to contribute to this effort and to support the changes that are necessary for success." As the meeting ended and the staff filed out, many of them stopped to speak with Sarah privately. Some expressed gratitude for her intervention. Others shared additional concerns about issues they hadn't felt comfortable discussing during her initial interviews. All of them seemed energized by the prospect of working in an environment where their contributions would be valued and their welfare would be prioritized. Walsh remained behind after the others had left, and Sarah could see that he was struggling with the magnitude of the task ahead of him. "General," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I meant what I said earlier. I'm committed to becoming the leader these people deserve." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of the sincerity that would be essential for his success. "Colonel, I hope you understand that words alone won't be sufficient. Your actions over the next few months will determine whether you have a future in the military. I understand, Walsh replied, and I want you to know that I'm grateful for this opportunity. I know I don't deserve it, but I won't waste it. As Sarah prepared to leave the installation the next morning, she reflected on the emotional journey that had brought her to this point. What had begun as a routine evaluation had become something much more personal and significant. She had witnessed the damage that poor leadership could inflict on dedicated military personnel,